Now, with a perspective of 49 years, looking
Don't say
back,
that word.
how does Brown look to you now? What about that promise that you thought would be fulfilled?
Well, as is true with any profound social policy, and that's what that was, it was difficult to see some of the ramifications. For example, while we thought that there would be an impact on the faculty, for example, in schools like North Carolina Central University, I don't think anybody really could fathom the extent to which the brain drain would then occur. And it's colleges and university campuses where we had rubbed shoulders with and been in close association, intellectual and social association with the thinkers in the African American community. These college campuses were about to lose some of the jewels of those educational institutions to the larger society. And yet I talked about in this editorial the need to have courage to take advantage of the promise of Brown. And I certainly didn't remember this, but when I looked at that editorial, it says that it's going to require that we push the skin of that envelope, that we force Brown to be applied as was intended by the Supreme Court, and that you have to do that by going to the doors of schools which have not admitted blacks, taking the risk, having parents feel that it was a good thing to send their children to environments which they considered and had every reason to believe were fundamentally hostile.
At the same time that you could have predicted that some of your teachers would end up at UNC or some other school over the passage of time. I read a study a while ago of lower school education in North Carolina. It described a devastating impact of Brown. High school principals who are black reduced from the thousands to less than 100. And in the lower schools, from thousands to even less than half 100. Tremendous loss of personnel. And these people don't go to white schools. They're just out of jobs.
They're out of jobs.
Now, could you have predicted, or did you think that would happen?
I didn't think that would happen. I thought that there would be more equity in the process of implementing Brown, that the barriers which you just described that confronted people who were moving out of the segregated black schools and institutions, those barriers would also be lowered so that there would be equal access for people who were then integrating, that was the word those days, integrating the system, and that they would not be penalized, that they would not be marginalized by the almost reverse discrimination efforts of the larger school systems to say, and it was almost cynical to say, yeah, well, you want equal schools, we'll show you what equal schools are about. We're taking the jobs, and the people who are in these jobs can go do something else somewhere else.
Well, this study also talked about another kind of loss, and that was the loss of the schools themselves, the trophies, the athletic accomplishments, the academic accomplishments, the history, the Saturday night football games, all that wiped away, not completely, but all that wiped away, at least in North Carolina and quite probably in other states too.
It was in North Carolina because there's something I think that is missed in the recollection of the decision and its impact, and that is that there had been agitation going on prior to '54 for equity. For example, the University of North Carolina had been inviting students to come and do student exchange. I was involved in the student exchange at UNC. Duke University, which was in the same town as North Carolina Central, had been involved in having students from NCC there and vice versa. So there was this movement underway to make the systems more accessible, mutually accessible. And I think that having been the case, it was assumed that the same patterns of equity and camaraderie that had pertained prior to Brown would just be continued and would be heightened. I don't think that anyone thought that you talk about the football, the talent drain, as the football players then went other places in North Carolina. I don't think that just wasn't expected. I just don't think that was expected. And yet, when you think about it, it probably should have been, because some of the more talented students, those who were not as risk averse as people tend to be, had already explored going to other schools that were not segregated. For example, I'm sure you remember that the University of Iowa, the University of Minnesota have a long tradition of having African American students there. And I knew athletes who went there because they got some good offers to play football. So, you know, we should have known that there was going to be almost a sea change from the perspective of the African American community. I don't think the sea change, in some places, it still hasn't occurred. You still have this unequal, this imbalance that we thought was going to be corrected by Brown. And you have another kind of imbalance, which is the balkanization that has come about by segregation in living, or discrimination in living accommodations, access to communities, balkanization of communities by race. The New York Times did a study a couple of years ago that showed that in the last decade there were more communities that had some representative numbers of blacks or whites, depending on where you're looking, than there are now, and that there are more communities that are exclusively either black or white than there have ever been. So those are things that continue to impact where people go to school and what kind of education they have, in addition to what was the intentional undermining, I think, of an easy and fair transition in southern states in the implementation of the Brown decision.